the great budget debate. We are so pleased that you could join WAND for this presentation, and we're very excited to hear from Kathy Robinson and Laicie Heeley. My name is Udzi Vokiwa. I am a Senior Program Associate at WAND, and I will be running the technology today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation. You can submit your questions for our presenters by typing them into the questions section of your panel. You should see it on the right-hand side of your computer screen. I'll ask those questions out loud to our presenters after they finish their presentations. And today's presentation will be recorded, emailed to you, and available online afterwards. If at any time you're having technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar directly at 1-800-263-6317. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Robinson, WAND's Senior Public Policy Director. Kathy?
All right, thank you, Udzi. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to go over quickly what we're hoping to cover today in the webinar. First, I'm going to just review the basic budget pies and sort of the budget process highlights. And then we have Laicie to go over the details of the defense budget. And then we're going to very quickly go over some resources and opportunities coming up. And we will have plenty of time for your questions. And as Udzi said, you'll be able to just type those in, and then Udzi will read them to us, and we will answer them. So just to get started, this is the big federal budget, the whole thing. It's over $4 trillion this year. And you'll notice that the biggest portion by far is this green C section, which is what we're calling mandatory spending. And mandatory spending are programs that are funded by Congress, already established with authorization laws that Congress has made. So these establish the federal programs, and it also mandates Congress to provide sufficient funds to keep the programs running. And if Congress wants to change the funding for these programs, then it requires a new authorization law. And a lot of this spending is what we call earned benefits programs. Some people call it entitlements, things like Social Security, Medicare, pension programs, Medicaid. The other little B section, this tinier sliver here, is the interest on the debt. And one thing that I would point out about this is that because under the President's vision of the budget, the debt will continue to go up. That means that the interest on the debt will continue to go up. And this was something that Republicans particularly are concerned about, particularly those fiscal hawks who are chairing the budget committees in both the House and Senate noted their concern about that. We're going to spend most of our time talking about stuff that happens within this budget pie piece called A, discretionary spending. Let me just move on to that pie. I've got some slides following our pictures with words so that you understand it when you see it separately. But this is the discretionary pie. So if you've looked at from the overall pie, the slice A coming down and making this pie, and you'll notice what is taking the biggest portion of this pie, and that happens to be the A, Pentagon spending, and that includes wars and nuclear weapons spending, all within what is called the 050 budget function, which is probably more detailed than you need, but Congress cares about that distinction. And this has, been for many years, more than half of the discretionary budget pie is eaten up by the Pentagon spending. And Laicie's going to go into more detail about that. But before she does, I want to just take a quick look at some of these smaller slices of pie. One is international spending. This is, I think, slice G on your pie. And that gets 4.7% of the discretionary budget. And then the other rest of the half, and people sometimes refer to this as domestic discretionary spending. It's pretty much everything else that you can think of that the government does. About a third of the spending flows very directly to the states. So the programs cover a real gamut, myriad of different programs, from things like home heating assistance, disaster relief, Head Start, higher education, community block grants, transportation, infrastructure projects, which of course is a big issue right at the moment. So this is a great graphic which I think kind of brings home the whole trade-off argument. One of our great WAND chapter leaders in Oregon came up with this last year. So I'm going to quickly go and talk a little bit about the budget debate and process this year, just in a kind of broad way. The first thing to understand is the President's budget request that we just went over, those budget pies. It really is just a request. It's kind of an opening serve. Congress is the entity that has the power of the purse. They're responsible to raise and spend money. So that means that there's going to be this whole process that unfolds, and we have a role to play in that. The next step is really going to be the Senate and House budget resolutions, which gives the Congress an opportunity to give its whole vision blueprint of the budget. And then there will be the appropriation process, which is the slicing of that discretionary pie. One of the big aspects of the debate this year will once again be something called sequestration, which has now become a household term. But that really, just to review the sort of ground rules, there was a Budget Control Act that came into force in 2011. Congress agreed to cap spending, discretionary spending, for each of the following 10 years. And there are separate budget caps on that A piece of the pie, A, Pentagon spending, everything in there except for the overseas contingency operations war spending. And then there's a separate cap on all the other discretionary spending, all the other pieces of the pie. And what happens is appropriated spending that Congress appropriates exceeds the budget cap, and there are no other deals or changes made to the law, which there have been in previous years. But if no changes are made, then there are automatic cuts, the sequestration cuts. So given that sort of quick history lesson, this year we have the President's budget request coming in over those set spending caps by about 7%. And half of that increase, again, is going to Pentagon spending. And the other half is spread across all the other pieces of the pie. And again, I just want to note that when we're talking about the Pentagon spending, defense spending, that does not include the Overseas Contingency Operations account. We call it the War Spending Slush Fund, and that's about $51 billion that's not subject to the budget cap. So, you know, in this process, the President said he wants to do away with sequestration. He referred to it as mindless austerity. And in order to compensate for that, he provided various different options in terms of tax cuts and reforms. Generally, there's a lot of resistance to that approach from the Republican-led House and Senate. And the big thing that WAND is concerned about is going back to that picture that I showed you of breakfast being provided for the F-35s, but none for anybody else. We want to make sure that those budget caps don't go away for the Pentagon spending and let them spend as much as they want while we enforce more harsh cuts on everything else. So that's our big concern, and that's kind of WAND's mission, is trying to find ways to shift excessive spending for Pentagon spending to other human and environmental needs. So now we're going to get a chance to look at what is that big piece of pie, how is it all being divided up. And we're very fortunate to have Laicie Heeley, who is the Policy Director at Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. She is a defense analyst who works on nonproliferation and Iran. She's a very busy woman, but one of the things that Laicie has done now for 6 years, she said, is put together this fabulous budget briefing book on the defense budget. And she has some really wonderful slides. She's going to go over the defense budget. So I'm turning it over to Laicie now.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for being on the call today and on the webinar. I, as Kathy said, am going to talk a little bit more about the sort of nitty-gritty details of the budget, and I will I'll dive a little bit further into, as Kathy talked about, the Overseas Contingency Operations account and the various accounts that exist within the Pentagon's funding request, and explain a little bit more about what's inside of those and what point out a few major debates that are going on in Washington right now and that we'll see play out as this budget goes through the process, first to a budget resolution and then to the defense authorization and defense appropriations ultimately, which will decide how much money actually goes to these programs. As Kathy said, this is all an opening bid. So here you can see where we are starting out in relation to last year. We have the president, and you can also see how these various within the what Kathy told you is the 050 account. You can see how the 050 account breaks down into the various aspects here. So our largest number, which the president has requested about $534 billion for, is the Pentagon base budget. So that is all the base spending, the people who work at the Pentagon, the military, all of the services present their own request, and the president then takes those requests and compiles them into this larger, full Pentagon request. All of those things generally fall, the large majority of them, in this base budget normally. Now, what we've had for a few years now is sort of a base budget that's split in two. We have the Overseas Contingency Operations account as a separate portion on top of the base budget. And that was created in response to a practice of passing a separate supplemental appropriations for the war for many, many years. So through the Bush years, we had supplemental appropriations. Congress passed these separately from the regular budget process, and that request was submitted just to fund the wars. And so the Obama administration, when they came in an attempt to try and sort of bring this war funding into the regular budget process, they decided to create the Overseas Contingency Operations account, which has become this very large account that is essentially an emergency supplemental appropriation, but is not, because it happens as part of the regular budget process now. The problem with that is that would be fine. The reason they created it is because it was to create more oversight. So that was a very noble reason to try and do that. The problem is that since that time, in 2011, we passed the Budget Control Act, which put in place both the Budget Control Act caps and sequestration. And when that was created, the Overseas Contingency Operations account falls outside of those budget caps, so it is immune to the budget caps. Although sequestration kicks in, sequestration actually does, and this is a technical detail, sequestration would also cut Overseas Contingency Operations were it to kick in, but the budget caps do not apply to the Overseas Contingency Operations account. They only apply to the base budget. And so what's happened over the years is that Congress and the Pentagon, and the Pentagon has even at this point in this budget request very openly acknowledged this fact, they have begun to shift programs that would normally appear in the base budget to the Overseas Contingency Operations account. And they've done this to try to get around the budget caps. So ultimately, although we still have this law in place, this Budget Control Act that controls how much spending is going up over the years, it's not entirely controlled because a large number of programs that should appear in the base budget are now appearing in the Overseas Contingency Operations account. And so although we should be phasing out this war funding because the wars have drawn down significantly, we still see that the President is requesting almost $51 billion for the wars overseas. And in the next slide, we'll take a look at exactly how that breaks down. The third account we have is defense-related activities at DOE. This is where all of your nuclear weapons spending is going to be. This is a large, largely, almost entirely devoted to nuclear weapons and various components. Other defense-related funding, the fourth, is sort of a grab bag, but look, some of it goes to the FBI, some goes to veterans programs, and that is more of an other account within the 050 request. So here you can see how Overseas Contingency Operations breaks down. This and this might come as a little bit of a surprise to anyone who's watching, the major operations going on overseas. I think the things that we are the most involved in right now are, the fight against ISIS, and that is, constantly in the news. But you'll see that the large majority of war funding is still going to Afghanistan, and that is largely, unfortunately, that account is, we don't know as much as we would like about that account because big swaths of it are classified. But what we do know is that a large portion of it is dedicated to recapitalization of the force, buying things that we used up in the previous wars. The interesting thing about that is that we've been recapitalizing the force throughout while the wars were still going on. So with as much money that's already been spent on replacing things, there's a little bit of a disconnect between how much we're still spending and how much we still need to replace. So where that disconnect, one of the places where that disconnect comes in is that a large portion of this money is still going to maintain infrastructure that we have overseas from previous wars. It's going to pay for a lot of those base budget programs that I talked about. It's going to a lot of things that ultimately should be shifted back into the base budget if we're talking about real, transparent, and accountable budgeting. So that is actually something that the President has recognized and calls for in his most recent budget request. He calls for shifting that those funds back into the base budget and eventually doing away with the OCO account entirely. Unfortunately, he also has the caveat in there that Congress must get rid of the budget caps before he'll do that, because the Pentagon and the President would feel that they need to continue to raise the base budget and cannot do that within the budget control caps. So here's a little breakdown of how this comes out by service. So with the Army, Navy, Air Force, and defense-wide. And the reason I include this is because there's a debate happening in Washington right now over what would be called the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. And that, or what is called the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, it was actually created in the defense authorization last year. So it exists, but right now there's no money in it. And the purpose of this account would be, which exists within the defense-wide fund right now, would be to fund the Navy's new Ohio-class replacement submarine, which is a nuclear submarine that's going to cost so much money that it would essentially take up the Navy's entire shipbuilding budget. They would be able to build nothing else but this submarine. And that's a submarine that will ideally, because nuclear weapons are meant to be a deterrent, we would never use. So the Navy would be spending its entire budget on something that we would never use. And so the Navy, the way that they have proposed that we deal with this is by shifting the money out of their budget and into a defense-wide, Pentagon-wide budget account. So this is largely a budgeting gimmick. It doesn't actually change how much is spent on the program, but it changes how much of a percentage is spent on the Navy versus the Air Force and the Army and the defense-wide accounts. And ultimately, it allows the Navy a path to both buy this program and buy all of the other things that they want to buy while not having to cut any of their own programs, because the programs that would be cut would be from the defense-wide fund, which contains a lot of other things. And what's interesting about this is that the Army already has a much smaller percentage share than the Navy and the Air Force do, but the Army doesn't have a nuclear weapons, it doesn't have a leg of the triad like the other two services do. And so the Air Force is already arguing that it needs the same kind of fund, while the Navy already has its fund, but the appropriators haven't put money in it yet. And the Army is sort of left over here saying, well, what do I get? And that's likely to become even more of a debate if money is put into that Navy account in the coming years. And so here we see the Budget Control Act caps throughout the years, and we can see on the third line the President's base budget request, ultimately coming in much larger, even out to fiscal year 20, 5 years from now, about $20 billion over the caps. So we're continuing, the President in his budget would very explicitly like to see the budget caps done away with, and would like to see an increased Pentagon budget over the years. And here we can see exactly how it comes out with the Budget Control Act caps and the Pentagon's base budget request, significantly higher. Just to give a little bit of context to that debate, this is the way that this is the Pentagon's. So each of these lines shows the Pentagon's request in fiscal year 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16. And this slide here gives a little more visual information to that. You can see that the Pentagon's request in 12, when the Budget Control Act was passed, was very high, and it has come down, but it's come down very slowly year after year to sort of to come down to where the budget caps would be, and it still remains, significantly higher. Now, so the President's, this is not something new from the President, essentially, is what this shows us. The President has sort of consistently expected to eventually bust the Budget Control Act caps. He has, been very consistent about that, and even in passing the Budget Control Act, had hoped to, make some sort of deal with Congress that ultimately raised revenues and allowed them to continue spending on the base budget and on the Pentagon budget. Congress has been unwilling to do that, because essentially what the President is doing when he asks for more money is he's forcing Congress to make the decisions and make the cuts, but which I think that he gambled in many years that they would not, but Congress has been even more unwilling to raise revenues and get rid of the caps, and they actually have kept them in place and continue to, even it looks like this year, may continue to stick with the Budget Control Act caps. Here you can see how the President's top line, the budget plus the whole 050 budget would go up in the out years, the years after his current request. Currently, we see that there is a $27 billion placeholder for the war accounts. This would be, in the President's ideal vision, rolled back in, but the budget would still continue to go up just as high as it does here. And now drilling down a little bit further into the nuclear weapons budget and the funding that we have at the Department of Energy, we can see how some things have shifted over the years, and they've actually shifted very much as our relationship with Russia has changed, and as particularly in the nonproliferation account. So we do have the weapons activities and the nonproliferation line items are the two line items that we'll deal with most today. The weapons activities account is exactly what it sounds like, while nonproliferation goes to programs like GTRI and nonproliferation programs with our partners overseas, securing with nuclear materials, various things like that. So both have gone up, but what's interesting about these is that they haven't, the weapons activities account has actually gone up more than it looks like, and the nuclear nonproliferation account has actually gone up a little bit less than it looks like. So we'll see, almost $9 billion for the weapons activities account this year, because some money for counterterrorism was actually shifted from the nonproliferation account, or from the weapons activities account, sorry, into the nonproliferation account. There's actually a little bit of a disparity there. So ultimately, the nonproliferation account has gone up by 5%, and the weapons activities account has gone up by 11%, which is quite a large jump for weapons activities under this president's request. This is significantly more information, probably more information than you want to know on the nonproliferation line items. But if you are interested in how things shifted, this year there was a large change to the nuclear nonproliferation account due to our changing relationship with Russia. As I mentioned, we've had some programs like the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, GTRI, have been phased out, and they've been moved into other accounts that will continue to work on nonproliferation activities abroad, but not in the same way that they did before. And so this gives a little bit of detail on that. The overall picture, though, on the nonproliferation account, you can see here is that we are still down very significantly from where we were in the fiscal year 2013, actually the fiscal year 2013 appropriation. So consistently over the past 3 years, the President has requested and Congress has enacted a significantly lower amount for those nonproliferation activities. And this, again, is a little bit more information just in case you want to drill down really far on this, on how the nuclear nonproliferation account, how the programs have been restructured. This information here goes into a little bit about the long-term costs of our nuclear weapons activities. So this is from the Congressional Budget Office. And so the reason why the Congressional Budget Office has provided this analysis over the past couple of years is because it's very hard, because of the way that nuclear weapons spending is placed all over the budget. It's sort of everywhere, lots of different line items. Some of it's in the Department of Energy, some of it's in the Department of Defense. Because it's sort of everywhere, it's very hard to dig out. And even in many cases, that information doesn't exist that you can dig out publicly. So CBO has provided this analysis that gives us not only a look at the 1-year cost of nuclear weapons and their various components, but also a look at the 10-year cost of nuclear weapons and their various components. So this most recent analysis for 2015 shows that total, we're spending about almost $24 billion a year on nuclear weapons. We're going to look at some other costs of various weapons that were requested in this particular president's request in a little bit later slide, but just for some context, the F-35, which is most certainly the Pentagon's biggest weapons program right now, their biggest undertaking, has gotten a significant increase this year. They're buying 57 planes as opposed to something like 36 planes last year, and it's getting $11 billion. So this is two entire F-35 programs put together, I think, is maybe a good way to look at it. And over the course of 10 years, this is going to grow because the submarine that I mentioned earlier is being replaced. Also, the Pentagon is developing the long-range strike bomber, and they're also developing new ICBMs, and all they're essentially replacing all three legs of the triad. So this is going to get very costly, actually even more costly in the 2020s and 2030s as those programs really begin to ramp up. So this is just another thing. This is actually directly from CBO. I took it from them because I thought it was such a great look at exactly how these programs will rise, and also the breakdown of what's coming from the Department of Defense, what's coming from the Department of Energy, and the total of the 10-year costs of nuclear forces. And what's interesting about this also in bringing up the costs of, for example, the long-range strike bomber, which is the LRSB at the bottom here in the asterisk, CBO only includes 25% of the cost of the B-52 and that program, because they also include a conventional component. So we would essentially be building them, we would most likely be building them regardless of nuclear weapons. But so they're taking a very conservative look at this here, and only including 25% of the cost, although even without them, this cost is, as you can see, extremely high. As I mentioned, in this year's President's request, we have $11 billion for 57 F-35s. This is altogether a very weapons-heavy request. $1.6 billion for 19 V-22 Ospreys, $1.9 billion for 3 littoral combat ships, and on and on. And we see $1.4 billion for the Ohio-class replacement sub, which is nuclear, and $1.25 billion for the new long-range strike bomber, $75.2 million for the modernization of the ICBM leg of the triad, and $36.6 million for development of a new air-launched cruise missile. So a lot of money going to nuclear programs, a lot of money going to big weapons programs, and some of the offsets that the President has proposed are having a new base realignment and closure, BRAC round, TRICARE reforms, things that although most analysts agree that they would be very useful, and the Pentagon has been calling for them for multiple years, Congress is less likely to agree to. And so that overall, I think, is just a sort of overall look. I think it'll be useful as well if you want to hold on to. We will be sending out the slides for some of that deeper information on the President's request, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come up along the way.
Thank you so much, Laicie, and also Kathy, for sharing this really helpful information with us. I know we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. For those of you who haven't yet submitted your questions, please type them by typing them into the question section of your box, and I'll read them out loud. But before we take questions, we're going to hear a little bit more from Kathy Robinson.
Thanks, Udzi. So this is just going to give you a chance to think up your questions for Laicie. I'm going to go over a little bit of just highlights of what's coming and let you know that there are lots of opportunities for you to engage in this debate about the budget. In March, which is just around the corner, there's going to be a debate beginning in the Senate about the budget resolution. This is the opportunity for Congress to put forth its entire budget blueprint. And there will be a debate in the Senate about this. There will also be a debate in the House. And in the House, it's a slightly different process. And not only will there be one budget resolution that the House Budget Committee developed, but also the Congressional Progressive Caucus and other caucuses are beginning to put together their own vision and blueprints of the budget. So that will be happening. And then through the spring, we will see opportunities on the Defense Authorization Act process, and then also the appropriations process. That's the process where we slice all the different pieces of the pie. And that will go through the spring and on into the fall. Of course, when they're supposed to get it done, Congress is supposed to have all the appropriations process done by the beginning of the fiscal year, which is October 1st, 2015. And I just kind of gone over that. And then I did want to highlight another opportunity for those of you in the field out there raising awareness about these issues, particularly is the Global Day of Action on Military Spending, which also happens to be Tax Day on April. That's what that for is. April 15th. Remember what day your taxes are due. We have a number of resources on our website, and I've given you the link here. We have budget pies. We have some fact sheets and some blogs. We also will be sending out action alerts. We'd love to work with you if you're interested in writing op-eds or letters to the editor. We are going to be trying to get everybody to meet with their members of Congress during the upcoming congressional recess, which is the beginning of April, the first 2 weeks in April. And so there's a website there for more information about that. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Udzi, and she's going to let you give us your questions, and we'll try to answer them.
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. We have a number of questions from our audience. Our first question is from Florindo Tronsoletti, and Florindo asks, is there anyone in Congress who actually wants to cut defense spending? And if so, how can we, amplify and work with them?
I will say something, and then Laicie can add to it if she would like to. There are a number of people that want to cut Pentagon spending, especially as it's gotten higher and higher, and we've seen the budget caps being threatened. We've gotten a lot of interest, not just from people who want to see more given to other discretionary programs, and so less to the Pentagon, but also from people that want to see just lower spending by the government in general, and so those kind of fiscal hops. So we've gotten a fair number of Republicans who want to see some cuts to Pentagon spending, as well as some Democrats who think that we're spending too much on the Pentagon and not enough on other investments. And we try to work with both sets of people. Sometimes Juan's message is a little more resonant with the people that want to spend more on other things like we do. But we work in a large tent coalition of organizations that also work across the aisle, as they say, with Republicans and others that are really looking at finding places to cut the budget. Laicie, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Well, just to echo Kathy, that, as she mentioned, that this has been a very important issue for work across the aisle. This has been one of the most active issues in that way, I think, and one that continues to be useful for both sides in coming together and coming up with cuts that they can agree on. This is something that we see a lot of unlikely folks who agree, either want to cut the Pentagon budget or even just agree that the Budget Control Act cap should stay in place. And so, what you guys do is amazing. I mean, you know to write to your congressperson and let them know, call them, meet with them, do all those things that you can do, and particularly if they're on relevant committees that have to do with the budget process, then that's even more helpful.
Thank you. And just a note from Michael Eisenschur. He says that the Congressional Progressive Caucus alternative budget includes significant cuts in Pentagon spending and elimination of the overseas contingency operations. So that would be nice. Our next question is from Betsy Kreitz. Betsy says, is referencing nuclear weapons, and she said, on the slide I saw $348 billion over 10 years, but I've also heard that we'll be spending $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. So what am I missing?
So that's a really great question, actually, Betsy. So CBO, as I mentioned, CBO has a pretty conservative estimate of what we are going to see from nuclear weapons spending over the next 10 years. And some of the things that they leave out have, other groups who have done estimates, independent estimates of the amount of money that we spend on nuclear weapons. They have included things like, some include missile defense, some include things like defense environmental cleanup, which cleanup of past nuclear weapons activity sites and current. And it's a very highly debated, even CBO notes it in their analysis, topic as to what should be included in a full figure of nuclear weapons spending. And CBO has again, taken a pretty conservative line with this, but has really tried to make an effort to include only those things that have an expressly weapons centric mission, and so rather than anything like cleanup that might be a little bit more that we ultimately might keep even if we were to get rid of nuclear weapons.
And if I could just add, that is all true. Some of the figures, though, some citations of that $1 trillion is over a 30-year period, which is right in keeping with the CBO estimates. So if you look at a longer period of time, we'll be spending about $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. At the same time that we've made this commitment to reduce our nuclear weapons arsenal, that's a lot of money.
Great. Well, on that note, can either of you explain a little bit more about the decrease in nonproliferation funding and sort of what that means for us?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that, and I'm sure that Kathy can go into even more detail on that nonproliferation funding amount. So actually, there is a small increase in nonproliferation funding this year, which is good and is actually unusual from what we've seen the past couple of years. We've definitely seen money going away from nonproliferation and largely into weapons activities, and that's something that we're going to watch for in the ongoing budget process. It's possible that Congress, as they seek to come down to the budget caps, may make more cuts in nonproliferation than they will they'll protect that weapons activities account. That's much more likely to be protected than the nonproliferation account. So a lot of those shifts that we see happening, as I mentioned, have to do with our changing relationship with Russia and changing priorities in what we're doing overseas. And Kathy, I don't know if you can expand on some of the specifics of what has changed this year versus what we were doing.
Well, no, I mean, you all have done the great detailed analysis with your charts, but
so we do. That's maybe even more detail than anyone needs.
Funding. There's one program that is of interest and concern to WAND, as well as many others, that is in the nonproliferation budget. I mean, largely the nonproliferation budget is, you think of this, these are things that really are preventing nuclear terrorism, right? Gathering up, securing, and downblending dangerous and vulnerable nuclear materials around the globe. And that seems like a pretty important high priority item. But there's one big chunk of the nonproliferation budget that's been there now for several years, and that is this facility in, it'll be in South Carolina at the Savannah River site to develop this mixed oxide fuel. And the idea was to use a plutonium-based fuel and be able to, once you have plutonium that goes into nuclear weapons, it's still plutonium and it's still very dangerous. And it's trying to figure out what do you do with this, the very back end of nuclear weapons. And MOX was what many of us think ill-begotten idea of how to deal with plutonium. But even though this program is just really not working, it's failing, but it has a lot of very strong supporters in Congress, so it keeps getting a lot of money. And I think even somewhat reluctantly, the Department of Energy put this in the budget again, but it's taking a big chunk of nonproliferation funding. The other thing about nonproliferation funding that has been true forever is that, if you went to a member of Congress and said, don't you think that funding things that prevent nuclear terrorism should be a high priority, they would say, yes, of course. But when push comes to shove, it's not a big pork item. It's not creating a lot of jobs in their district. So it's a hard thing to get the kind of constituency that it needs. So that's been a struggle with nonproliferation funding.
Thank you both. That was really helpful. So our next question, sorry, just trying to find it. So why is it that the budget caps don't apply to the OCO account?
So the reason originally why the budget caps were not, why the Budget Control Act excluded the OCO account is because it is war funding. And so the idea there is that the President should be able to request whatever the Department of Defense needs and whatever the military needs to fight the wars that we're currently fighting. Now this has become a very complex question over the years as the OCO account has come to include more things that would normally be found in the base budget. So originally that made a lot of sense, and now it makes much less.
Thank you. Next question, can you expand on what's going on with the F-35? How much money was requested for the program, and how much is that in relation to the overall budget request?
Sure. So the amount of money that was requested for the program was about $11 billion. Someone had a really great estimate, did the exact numbers on how much of the overall procurement request that was. I think it's something like close to 8%, I believe, of the procurement request, and that is it's a big chunk. It's a big chunk of what we're spending and what we're buying, and the program itself has had a lot of problems over the years. It's one of the reasons for those problems is the concurrent development. They're actually building the planes prior to being completely done designing them, or prior to being completely finished with the testing. So so ultimately, problems are popping up as we're actually building the planes, and then we have to go back and fix those planes that have already been built, and it ends up we have a lot of cost overruns and the problems that you've seen with the F-35 going from originally being a pretty affordable plane to being a very highly unaffordable plane.
Thank you. Next question. So what part of the Pentagon budget covers cybersecurity, and how much of a priority is this for the administration? Does it seem that Congress is adequately funding the emerging threat of cyber attacks and nuclear terrorism?
Yeah, so the cybersecurity appears in the Pentagon's base budget. There is a significant chunk of money for cybersecurity, but and I will say, I believe that chunk of money increased, though I can't speak to the exact increase without the numbers in front of me this year, but is still relatively small compared to the amount of money that's being spent on actual weapons systems. So I know that the Pentagon has made an effort over the past few years to bump up their cybersecurity spending, and when you look at the numbers, they're still relatively small, but I think you know, you're not necessarily buying the same types of things that you will be in the other other line items.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a few more questions. Our next question is sort of about how to talk about this issue with Congress. So for most people, when they think about the Pentagon and the Pentagon budget, they think about the troops and military families. So how do we talk about cutting Pentagon spending while not alienating people who are, you know, who have ties to the military, and just communicating that this isn't about harming the troops or military families?
It's always it's always important, I think, to acknowledge whenever you're talking about the Pentagon budget that that talking about the Pentagon budget and talking about how high the Pentagon budget is does not mean that you are not pro-military. We at our organization try to do that, you know, or try to be very careful about that specific distinction, because we are you know, not anti-military, absolutely, and feel that the troops should be taken care of, and this of course gets particularly hard when you're talking about issues like TRICARE, the medical program, and that hasn't, you know, the copays haven't gone up with the same rate as you know, regular folks' copays and various things like that. But ultimately, when you're talking about these overall numbers and these overall increases to the Pentagon budget, a lot of these are due to a focus on weapons systems, big, huge planes, big, brand new submarines, brand new everything, essentially. And the military has really benefited from, you know, quite a few years of war in that, and Secretary Gates, back when he was the defense secretary, talked about this a lot, has really benefited from the, you know, sort of spigot of war spending being open and flowing. You're able to sort of buy all the big fancy new toys, and it's hard to shut that spigot off when the wars come to an end. And that's still what we're seeing in a large portion of these increases and a lot of these programs. And the important thing is just that we are, you know, making a strategy for the future, that we're budgeting to that strategy, and that we're honestly equipping those people on the ground to fight the wars that we are currently fighting, and not to fight our past, are these things like replacing all three legs of the triad when we're talking about, you know, nuclear weapons that may never be used, and then you know, not necessarily to taking that money away. There are trade-offs. You have to take money away from somewhere else in order to build those very expensive programs.
Yes, I would also just add that you know, military families count on a lot of other investments being made in the states where they live. And that is, you know, we're spending all of our money on the Pentagon, on that giant slice of the pie, then we're not spending money on education, on clean water, on all those other things that are really important to military families and veterans. Many people are surprised to learn that veterans is a separate slice of the pie, so it's not really included in that giant Pentagon spending piece. And that is another area where, you know, we really think the investments need to be very solid and secure, and not not undermined in any way. But they are also being squeezed by these, as Laicie said, all these giant weapon systems taking up a huge portion of our budget.
Great. Well, I just want to say a big thank you to Kathy and to Laicie for sharing this very helpful information with us, and thank you to all of you at home who joined us online. Please be sure to fill out the survey, which will appear on your screen when the webinar ends. We really welcome your feedback. And we'll also be sending you an email, as we mentioned, with the link to the recording and with the slides presented in this webinar. So thank you so much. And with that, we're going to end the webinar.